thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Today we are here to have a bit of a chat about sustainability, environmental and social sustainability. So thank you all for joining us. Um, just to give a brief overview of what we're going to talk about, and then I'll introduce you to our lovely panel for the day and we'll get cracking. We've got an action-packed agenda. We could probably chat for about 3 hours today, but we're not going to do that. So let's touch on as much as we can. And then if anyone has any questions, please pop them in the chat. We'll have some Q&A time towards the end of the call. And if we don't get to them, we'll make sure we pick those up with you afterwards. So today we are here to explore the world of sustainability, the impact that that has on the marketing industry, the impact that that has on our brands and on our agencies, and what we can do to grow in a sustainable manner for long-term success. So today we are going to do a light touch on the landscape and some of the key frameworks. We're not going to dig too deep into that because that can grow arms and legs very quickly. We are going to look at how we can bring sustainability into our business strategies, how we can align that with business goals, how we can align that with our activities for long-term success. We'll have a look at sustainable marketing. So what does that look like in terms of campaigns and the environmental impact of that? And then lastly, we want to have a look at the role of agencies in driving sustainability. Without further ado, I will give you a brief introduction to our panel and then we'll get cracking. So first up, we've got Kirsty McDonald from Material. So Kirsty is Insight and Sustainability Director at Material. She works with organisations to help formulate their ESG frameworks, their goals, objectives, and how that then turns into initiative and communications, and is very, very good at the watch outs of how not to get caught out at the end of that. Next up, we've got Ray Stevens from Rubin Digital. Ray is Managing Director at Rubin, and as an agency, they create and deliver sustainable digital strategies, particularly in the retail and e-commerce space. Ray is also vegan and sort of lives what he says, very passionate about animal welfare, conservation and sustainability. So I think that's really important is how are you living your life outside of work? Are you truly sustainable in the way that you live and operate your life? And can you say the same about your teams? Then we've got Pete Martin, founding director of Always Be Content. Pete's an experienced creative strategist, has won a number of industry awards, has led ABC through B Corp accreditation, and Pete's been at the cold face of what is deemed to be traditional sustainability, working with a number of the energy organisations, myself included back in the day, and also across water companies. So you've seen the large end of sustainability targets and goals, Pete. And then lastly, we've got Christopher, who is co-founder of Net Zero Media. Christopher is in the UK at the moment, but has joined us all the way from sunny Australia. So it's lovely to have you on board. Chris has developed a world-leading methodology to measure the impact of media and activity. So not just the impact of marketing spend on carbon, but actually the full measurement. So we'll come into the detail of that. Really interesting because Chris works globally. So interesting to see how the UK fares compared to other parts of the world there. So that's our lovely panel for today. You'll hear from me briefly, but mainly it's going to be down to our four experts to take us through today. So I think it's really interesting to see what's the appetite for sustainable change at the moment. We go through peaks and troughs depending on what else is going on in the world. So is the need to be more sustainable growing, or are we focused on other things? Are there other big agenda items? One of the recent Cantor reports showed that the biggest consumer concern globally floats across three areas is economy, war and climate. at the moment, economy and war are tipping slightly higher in the range of concerns, and climate sort of 7% below both of those. So it's still up there as a concern, but there are other things in people's minds. So interested to hear from the panel what that appetite is. But also, we can't ignore the fact that the US have just left the Paris Agreement back in January. So what message does that send out to the rest of the world? What impact is that likely to have for us globally? So if I could open that up to the panel, if anyone wants to jump in and add some thoughts.
Would you like me to go first, as I'm the
Yeah,
I'm yeah, and thank you for turning on some fantastic weather. I normally join these sort of conferences in the middle of the night. It's nice to do it in the daylight. Yeah, so I'm in London for a couple of weeks talking to various organisations, not necessarily agencies, but the other end, either the media owners or the corporates. And I think the corporates are the ones I'll just touch on. There is a great appetite for understanding the emissions that are coming from the activity of advertising. We focus on the media side, but this sits in there. They are reporting their scope 3 emissions, and the work that we do, if you're a media agency or you're actually a media owner, is actually being included in that reporting. Unfortunately, to date, because there's been no other opportunity, it's been done on spend based. So we have this arbitrary number, which is over engineered, gives us no information to allow us to do the reduction. So
Chris,
the people we're talking that.
Can I just jump in a little bit there, because we will cover off reporting in detail later on in the call.
Yeah.
I think if we could probably just open up with a bit of a theme.
I'm just saying there is a great appetite. I think what I found today, people do want. There is a need. They are actually looking at numbers at the moment. They're just looking at the wrong numbers. So there is definitely a great need for information around the environment. In the case that I work on, is the actual figures that help them to actually put reduction strategies in place. To date, there hasn't been that information, but there is definitely a hunger from media owners and the corporates for that information. And that is globally. So I'm here in London. We do work in the States. Yes, there's a bit of an issue over there with an orange-haired man, but the big corporates who work globally still have this on their agenda and understand we have a 10 to 20 year framework they're working in as organisations, not a 4-year term where it's all a bit strange. So in Australia, it seems we're a bit advanced, which is unusual for us down there. But lots of mandatory reporting in there. You have CSRD, which is in Europe and replicating in UK. That's actually going to drive change. I think.
Brilliant. And what are we seeing from a consumer perspective from some of these smaller brands? Is it as big an appetite from them at the moment?
Well, I mean, if I can jump in there, it's like, interestingly, it's like we talk about obviously the economy, war, and climate, but they're all intrinsically linked. And the fact that climate change will be the driver of war, will be the driver of conflict over the scarcity of resources and water. We're already seeing it. Yeah, and then that directly obviously affects the economy. But that's just a side point. But so in terms of an appetite, I mean, I've just literally come back from a conference in Paris, a 3-day conference called Change Now. It's the largest global conference for solutions for the planet. And it was actually refreshing to see that there was 40,000 people passed through that conference in 3 days. And there was all kinds of change makers from all aspects of life and society, from, mums and dads with their children coming and experiencing, looking at eco solutions, through to big brands and big celebrities really, really championing change for the planet. So it's interesting. I would say there is an appetite, but that appetite is possibly seen just at a contained level. It's about how that message is going to move up. I would say this is a bit of a bottom-up scenario where we're at the moment.
I think to build on that, I think we're at a sort of a slightly dangerous point. I I don't know if anybody saw yesterday, the Tony Blair Institute came out and said they thought net zero was unattainable and was unpopular with the public. So I think there's a sort of narrative building, partly fueled by the rise of the right wing, partly fueled by fear of the right wing in the UK and Farage and so on, who see net zero as a target. But I think that is not really reflective of people's real attitudes. I think what we're seeing is an attempt to turn that into an agenda and a sort of that sort of pushback against green policies, elements of green hushing, trying to suppress fight against global warming, and to revive the fortunes of the fossil fuel companies that hardly need reviving, to be honest. So I think there's, you would not be surprised at all to find that some of that narrative is coming from the usual right wing sources through social media. You wouldn't be surprised to find that at all. So again, we're at a sort of crux point, and I think it's important for all of us, the coalition of the willing, the people of good conscience, to come together and to be absolutely crystal clear about not only the necessity of a green revolution, but the fact that it is such a commercial opportunity for everybody. That all of the economics and rational thinking is on the side of the angels in this one. Onshore wind and solar are half the price of gas powered electricity. It just doesn't make any sense. So, I think everybody who's on the call is obviously, glad to see everybody on here in such good numbers. But if we can band together and be crystal clear in what we're saying, this is the future. There is no other future. Let's get on with it.
Yes, and just to put my bit in, definitely we're at a crux, but I think the crux is still very much weighted on the side of action. And as with everything, the questions are ideological and practical, and perhaps the narrative at the minute has swung to an ideological one. The statistic that follows up the statistic that you cited about war, climate and sustainability being the top three concerns of consumers is interesting in that it follows up and says that of all the organisations in the world that consumers think the responsibility to drive sustainability is business, is producers, the people who are producing, who are creating and who are emitting and profiting from that. So it does put the responsibility firmly with us. In terms of the anti-ESG climate, I think we can all look around us with open eyes and look it in the face and see that the impacts are real, that they're increasing, that our government still has a net zero target, that every other major economy other than the US is still absolutely aligned to a net zero future by 2050. By 2050, businesses absolutely still need to adapt and be resilient and not risk having stranded assets. So I think some will use it as an opportunity to water down. I would say this is the opportunity to double down. And just to reflect something that Chris says, we have a 20-year sort of window to do this. This is on our watch and it is absolutely achievable. We're creative people and it's going to require creative transformation, but we can do it.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. So if we move on now, Kirsty, are there any key frameworks? Are there any key goals beyond the ones that you've just mentioned that we should be aware of on the call for context?
I'm going to try and keep this really light. I do have a handy, not very pretty, but handy crib sheet, which I'm happy to share with people afterwards. I think people talk about net zero, and net zero is the language of business reporting for emissions. So it's important to get quite comfortable with the language of net zero. It's a really good language for businesses because when you think about it, it sort of sounds like an accounting term. So you think about if you've got a cost, a financial cost to sell your products, there's also a carbon cost to sell your products. You have to get familiar with where that cost comes from. So net zero and the scopes are an important language to start with. That all ladders into what is referred to as the NDCs, that when we report into As businesses, we report into our country, and our country declares its NDC, so our progress towards the Paris Agreement. But at a business level, people might be more familiar with, they might have heard like SDGs, which is the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, and they might have heard of things like Race to Zero. And I think it just depends on the size of your company and where your operations are as to what sort of structure you might want to align to. SDGs are great for bigger multinational companies who have interests in lots of different countries where the impacts on their economy are vary greatly. Whereas Race to Zero, that's great for really small to medium businesses like ours. These are voluntary frameworks that you can just align to and make sure that your strategy ladders into. What's great about Race to Zero is it is for NGOs, and it's a way to mobilise small to medium businesses. It's voluntary disclosures of your emissions progress year on year. But what it does for us as a business, for whom sustainability is not our actual core business, is it means that we're forced to declare, we're forced to actually have a deadline for when we produce those reports. So voluntarily we can align with these sort of ideological and quite practical frameworks. On a much more serious note, obviously, there are mandatory reporting frameworks, and the crib sheet, I can share that on, people can look at them. In the UK, if you're operating in the UK, mainly they're associated with energy assessments and reporting, and it's frameworks called ESOS and SECR, and they apply if you're a company that's about 250 employees in size, about 36 million turnover, about 18 million on your balance sheet. So that's right now. Incoming is the UK sustainability reporting standards, and they're going to align probably more or less to what's developing in Europe, which is the ESGR. You might have heard about the European Omnibus, some delays in the and some watering down of the frameworks in the EU. What I would say is, I'd actually say there's been a lot of sustainability people saying that's like a bit chicken licking, the sky's falling in. I don't subscribe to that point of view. From my experience, so many businesses aren't ready for this level of reporting. So it takes the threshold of companies that have to report in Europe from employees. It was 250 employees, that's now 1,000. So that knocks a lot of companies out. I think what it does is it gives loads of companies a couple of years to get the ground under their feet, do their baseline, measure their own emissions, work out a mitigation plan, and then look at their supply chain. That can take a couple of years just to get that journey up and running in a meaningful way. So I'm not going to go, the great global standard is the SBTI. I'll share my crib sheet. I don't really want to go any heavier than that for the purposes of the call.
I think that's great for just now, Kirsty. I think it just gives people a bit of context if we get into acronym world, sort of where that all fits. So I think now let's take a bit of an industry view into this. So are brands truly sustainable at the moment, or are they just greenwashing? And really, what do you have to do to become credibly sustainable? And I'm sure there's lots of situations where that has gone very, very wrong. People have tried to cut corners. So Pete, I'm sure at the cold face of brand and creative, you've seen that many times over. So if I can hand over to you just to talk to us about how you can become a credibly sustainable brand.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. One of the highlights of my career was I was working with an academic called Professor Phil Hanlon, who's a professor of public health at Glasgow Uni, a really inspirational character. And the most enlightening thing he ever said to me was, he said, all enterprises are human enterprises. And he parlayed it back to Plato, and he said, Plato's idea of that any successful enterprise has to be based on the true, the good, and the beautiful. So it has to be based on facts. It has to be ethical in some way, but it also has to lift the human spirit and to be focused on people. And I think if you go back to the sort of rise of Thatcherism and the economist Milton Friedman, he said, Milton Friedman said, the business of business is business. The naked pursuit of profit is what this is all about. That has proved to have horrible outcomes. If you look at Enron and all the rest of it. So the focus on putting people first is really what's at the heart of any good sustainability strategy. It always made me laugh when if anybody's been been involved in financial services when the whole industry had a thing called TCF, treating customers fairly, as if that was a completely radical idea. Not stealing from your customers is seems like a fairly basic idea, and that sort of idea of in terms of real customer experience, what really leads to success, not just in terms of net promoter scores, but the ability to develop relationships with your customers, to put your customer first, and for them to reward you with ongoing business. Most profit that you can get from in business is derived from nurturing relationships over a long period of time. So I think that's what's critical to successful performance. The other thing I would say, and there's been some pushback on this over in recent years, where it was, previously it was easy to see how ESG stocks outperformed the market. The war in Ukraine and the rise in fossil fuel prices and all the rest of it has sort of muddied the water to some extent. But operational quality and financial performance are still aligned with better management, and better management is interested in its own long-term risks, and that aligns completely with ESG concerns. So I think it's pretty straightforward. People just need to get their heads straight around what their priorities are. One, looking after your customers. Two, operational and financial quality over the long term, your long-term risks. And if you do that, you inevitably end up in looking at sustainability, because if your profits aren't sustainable, what are they? They're up and down. Great this year, not bad next year. So the strategies for communicating that are pretty straightforward. I think it's you can tell the times that it's gone terribly wrong. I don't know if anybody remembers back. Volkswagen put a Super Bowl ad in I think it was 2019, something like that, and they talked about how it was a little girl in a soapbox derby and her dad saying, if only life treated women fairly, wouldn't that be a great thing? And then they took a picture of their board of middle-aged white men. And everyone went, what the fuck? You're saying this and spending massive amounts of money on the Super Bowl. And of course, what happens in public then becomes what happens underneath, because it wasn't a secret that the scandal over the vehicle emissions that they'd hidden. And when that came out, their share price dropped 40%. It cost them 30 billion in fines, and some of their execs were facing criminal charges. So it's not just the sort of the front end of greenwashing; it's what it sort of means at the back end of it, of what really is shielding bad practice. So the critical thing for me is putting people first, yes, but then secondly being honest about it, and being realistic about where you are on that journey. If they'd come out and said, look, our vehicle emissions aren't where we'd like them to be, we're really working on it, people would have been comfortable with it. It would have helped them a great deal. And then I think the other thing is just about making it stick. If you've got to tell that story. There's a great book by Chip and Dan Heath called "Make It Stick." About telling stories, making it personal and credible. So I think that's the sort of the key components of making it. If it go back to Plato, is it true? Is it ethical? Does it lift the human spirit? Does it support your customers? And are you committed to it, not just on the outside, but all the way through your supply chain and through your working practices? And if you do that, that kind of operational excellence that comes from that will give you a business that will be sustainable. And I think that's worth fighting for and worth striving for.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pete. Ray, if I can just ask you, there may be some people on the call who are thinking, well, this feels so far removed from my day-to-day operation, whether I'm an agency, whether I'm a client, how do I get started? How do I go about that creation? And how do I get on the journey? And how do I make it work for my business? Because it's got to work for your business now. It's got to be an evolution. So what advice can you give people to get them moving on that journey?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's an interesting question. It's about being pragmatic as well. I think it's the first thing to think about, is that it's such an overwhelming prospect if we think of the doom end of the spectrum and how overwhelming that can be. Then thinking that there's so many different things that we need to do. It's like, where do you start? And for us, it was very much taking the microscope on our own business and actually just making a pledge that we're going to look into how we can become sustainable. And I started that journey within the business and set up essentially a sustainability lead person within the business. And then we started going along a route of looking at net zero, because, whilst that word is starting to become, it's not a thing that people like to necessarily reference these days. For us, it was a great starting point. What does it mean to be net zero? What's it all about? And that was our learning process. And then from that, we then started to think about, although it being basically spend-based carbon accounting, we linked up our accounting platform with an accounting solution so we could then start to put some form of benchmarks into our business, actually start measuring, becoming consciously aware as a business that we're contributing to greenhouse gas emissions through what we do. Actually, just how we work, how we come to work, the kit we use, the coffee we serve, from every single aspect of the business, we looked at it from end to end and started to measure and benchmark that. And whilst that sounds like a lot of work, we're a business that there's 14 of us, and that was one person working on that, but not full time either. And this has been over a long period. So we're just coming into our 4th year of reporting. But what that's done is it's driven us to kind of start to build a roadmap, because obviously no one's perfect, and there's so many different things we need to do. So very recently we signed up to a platform called Future Plus, which is very much aligned to measuring and evidencing your performance aligned with the UN SDGs. And whilst being a small agency, and we're not a factory, we're not putting things in rivers and doing that kind of stuff, there was a lot of areas or particular key SDGs which were very relevant to our business and to our industry. So what that's done is it's given us a short and medium term roadmap of the things we need to address. And it isn't necessarily just around environment and carbon. It's like, for example, even as a small business, having an anti-slavery policy in our staff handbook. But I know that technically it's not that relevant to us, but actually that's quite an awareness element. So we're actually starting to build more conscious thinking into the fabric of the business. And that is conscious thinking is across everything. And I think that's why it's such an interesting kind of journey to take. And, we can now evidence that back and we can report that. And in turn, we feel that we're positioning ourselves much better to be stronger to go out to our customers now and start sharing our learning. Because talking about, greenwashing and appetite is that, our customers are not coming asking us and saying, Ray, can you make our tech stack more sustainable, please? Absolutely not. They are thinking, obviously, economics, and it's going to cost money and those elements. But I actually think that there's just a massive skills gap. Clients come to us with their so-called risk register, and they list these top sort of 10, 20 risks associated with their IT. Disaster recovery, cybersecurity, is Ruben Digital going to go under the bus at any time? These types of typical questions that IT companies ask, the IT departments ask. But one thing they never ask about is about sustainability. So how sustainable is our tech? Where's our power coming from? What about AI? It's an interesting, but we're taking that back. Does that make sense?
That's really interesting. It's really interesting on a couple of points, right? It's interesting that you don't have to start with a huge grand plan, which can be really daunting. It's taking a look at some day-to-day things you already do and getting yourself on those starting blocks, I think, is really important. But one of the questions that I had for the panel today is, how important is it for clients to work with sustainable agency partners? And from what you're saying, Ray, it's not forefront in their mind. It's not really something that's on a tick list. Some industries, absolutely, it will be, but is that need growing? So do we need to be able to demonstrate that we have sustainable credentials when we're going into client pitches? And are clients starting to prioritise B Corp agencies over non-B Corp? So is that something we're starting to see coming through in the industry?
I've never filled in a tender that hasn't asked it in quite significant ways. It was one of our original motivations for becoming a B Corp. We were consistently faced with the question of like, do you have ISO this and ISO that? And we always had answers about, we didn't have ISO, but we did all this other stuff. But it was kind of unstructured how we did it, and we were looking around for a way to make the question go away. And that's why we ended up going through the B Corp process, because it gave us a very simple answer to what was quite a painful question. But I would say any major business that you're working with always has that on their agenda. I've never filled in a tender. I can't remember a tender where I haven't had to fill it in.
It's a complete opposite experience for us. But I think that's potentially the scale of the brands we work with as well, because we're still very much in the SME to small corporate sector. And it doesn't quite factor into that at all.
Yeah, we only work with major corporates. So.
Yeah.
And Kirsty, you've recently gone through B Corp
Yes.
in about the last sort of 18 months. So what was your reasoning for going down that path?
It's a heuristic, it's a complete shortcut. When people see it, it stands for a lot and it doesn't require a lot of explanation. But actually, at the end of the day, it was because it was really core to our values and because a lot of our business was really aligning behind this. So you've got to walk the talk or talk the walk. I never know what way that goes. But what I would say about, is it important? It's critical, because we've just written the supplier guidelines for a big organisation. It's a group that works with a lot of brands, and it's going to be mandatory to remain on supplier and procurement frameworks, to have at least a grounding of your footprint in the next couple of years. I mean, it's not coming tomorrow, but in the next couple of years to have the basics in place and show that you're on a journey, because you will start to get things like little surveys that are called maturity surveys from your big suppliers, and they're going to be checking across their whole supply chain just which of their organisations that they're buying from by turnover are at what level of their journey. And then there will be a plan to engage with the suppliers that are really important to them, but it is important. And plus, emissions are all linked. So our scope 3 is part of someone else's upstream or downstream. So it's really important to just be part of the solution and getting on the journey as a business. That's you becoming part of the solution, and we are all linked. So becoming a solution in your supply chain.
Yeah, Kirsty, that's a really good point about that, the guidelines, because again, the question is, do I have to start reporting if I was a small business? Because whatever legislation, voluntary or mandatory, doesn't cover small organisations. But at the end of the day, they are part of that supply chain. Therefore, if the big organisation you're working with has to report, they want to know, to start with, in an easy way, but as the time goes on, in a more detailed way, from an activity based, what the emissions are from the parts you are contributing to the overall emissions for that big organisation, who has to report and be audited and do all those things. So that's good that work's occurring. It's not occurring very widely, because I say if you start from nowhere, you've got 2 to 3 years to start getting this right. It will take you that long to get your house in order.
Just on that, Chris, and this stat is 100% taken from your website, so thank you for that. But digital advertising is estimated to be 3.5% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, which probably none of us realise, none of us really think about that. That's a massive number. You add the other media in, you're exceeding 4%. So I think reporting and accountability really important, but how do we do that right, Chris? Because we can be reporting lots of things that are not accurate or they're not effective. So you've developed a model that moves us away from just looking at spend and measuring against spend, and actually looking at it at an activity level. So can you just tell us a bit more about the effectiveness of that reporting? Because as well as doing the things, everyone will be sitting thinking, how do we effectively measure this going forward?
Yes, so I'm going to be really pragmatic here. A lot of our business comes from major corporates who cannot move or have been reporting spend-based advertising expenditure, mostly their media spend, and they see that is a large number they can't move. Therefore, if they come to us and we actually break it down into what the actual activity is, so it's not just one single number regardless of what media you buy. It's actually every single channel and every single activity in the channel. The detail is broken down and you get a more precise number, which is normally a lower number. and you get, it's always a lower number because it's not over-engineered, and it allows that organisation to start discussing with their agency partners. But importantly, again, pragmatically, these companies that normally are doing this work have got net zero targets. If they've got net zero targets, they are buying offsets or compensations or whatever word they choose to disguise that in. But that's a cost of business. By doing it in a more granular way, it's a smaller cost of business. So we start to get this momentum for reporting coming from all the strange places like procurement, who care about the money. I don't think they already care about saving the planet, but it's a business. So, and that feeds through actually to other areas of the organisation. Marketing now needs to get involved more, which they weren't necessarily before because they're too busy. Now they're actually engaged, and we go, let's actually plan this through. So there's some things happening now. That's what we do. We've seen it come from that end, and actually now it's feeding into the media owners. The agencies, unfortunately, are still sitting there passing data around, but you know, we all need to help that. And I'm talking about media agencies more than the creative or the research companies, etc., in the middle. So it's maybe a different area for a lot of the organisations on the call are, but it's going to affect everyone. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Chris.
I was just going to just chip in on a bit, carrying on about the reporting and talking about, you know, having sort of that sustainability credentials moving forward as part of the procurement process. I mean, interestingly, when we've been doing our measuring, particularly scope 3, is we've been going to the big companies, the big suppliers, the Microsofts and all the different organizations and asking them for that information so we can feed that back in. Can we get it?
No.
It is really, really difficult. You know, so the thumb screws may be being put down on the smaller sized agencies, but actually, you know, as part of the procurement cycle, but it's the other way around. It's like, well, what are you doing? Yeah, and getting those answers. You know, now we're finding that a challenge. We have done.
Yeah, right. It's a major problem. They've got walled gardens. You're not going to get in them, or the big play, or what would say the major media owners, which are Google, Amazon, Meta, and would throw TikTok in. They're going to dominate the whole media landscape. You cannot get any data from them. I've got 3 postgraduate students in Sydney working on this. What's the size of the server network in the world? What percentage of that is taken up by media? And the big one, so that gives us a picture, and that's going to be based on academic papers because we can't find out, and that will be published and shared with everybody. And I think one of the conclusions will be we don't know, but this is what we think it must be. And the other thing is we asked also, yes, if we understand the size of that energy crunching machine called the internet, and we understand what bit we're using, what's AI going to do to that? Again, AI could potentially be a wonderful thing, but we have this energy guzzling machine. What does that do to the environment? So that's a big picture question, that one now.
It's really interesting that you say that, Chris. I read an article 2-3 weeks ago from a professor at the Queen Mary University in London. And ChatGPT apparently, I have not fact checked this, but ChatGPT apparently uses more power in their data centers than 117 countries consume in a year. Again, I don't know what size those countries are, but that is phenomenal. We were at an agency dinner last week, which some of you were at, and we were talking about the benefits of AI and the benefits to our industry, and it's, you know, it saves money. But what's the other side of that? What is that doing? Not just environmental sustainability, but social sustainability as well. So it's trying to manage that balance. I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts on that.
I have, yeah. I mean, this comes back to my point about the skills gap and then not asking the right questions in the framework. So because I mean, AI is an incredible thing, and you know, and like you say, can AI save the planet? It's got the potential to, you know, but these are one of the questions that people ask. But for me, it's like it's when big tech introduces something in there, it creates such a hype and such a demand that everyone gets on this bandwagon. And starts to experiment and learn and understand and typically take shortcuts. But before that happens, an organization typically puts no fundamental principles around AI. What should we be thinking? What are the core things we need to do? What are the ethical questions that we need to ask, the environmental questions we need to ask about adopting a new technology, and how does that fit into our ESG? So that's where, the strategies need to align. So, I find it personally really alarming when I see such unfettered use of AI in all different quarters, in all different businesses, without any form of formal governance or understanding, complete lack of understanding of the environmental impacts that AI cause. And ChatGPT obviously is the one that everyone's using, but it's possibly the worst out of the stack. So yeah, and that's where it comes back to governance, understanding, and bringing that strategic planning into play. But that's always been one of the challenges of IT, is understanding.
Yeah, Ray, and hopefully in a couple of months we'll share that knowledge when it's actually out. But that gives us some grounding of what the problem we're trying to address and what the future forecasts are for that. It's not a major body of work, but at least it's going to be evidence based, because we'll hear from the people who are doing it. They'll tell a different story about all the benefits of AI, but we also need to understand what it's actually going to do from an environmental point of view.
No, that would be a good piece of work for sure. Yeah.
I'd just like to turn the conversation round. I'm just very conscious of time, so I just want to turn the conversation round a little. We've talked a lot about accountability. We've talked a lot about reporting and measurement. So we just get our creative hats back on. Consumers are looking for us to be transparent, to be authentic, to be responsible, whether we are a brand and whether we're an agency working for that brand. How do you turn that into impactful campaigns and communications? So it doesn't just need to be the cold face of campaigns. It can include stakeholder engagement. It can include annual reporting. But how do we make those campaigns really impactful to support their sustainability agenda? Kirsty, I know that's something that you engage clients on a lot.
Yes, and because with social and environmental sustainability communications, there are rules of engagement, so to speak, to make sure that you don't fall foul of the Green Claims Code or whatever the regulations are in your market, but also that you don't chip away at or undermine your own credibility and the brand equity that you've built up along the way. And I think a lot of people are awful scared about saying the wrong thing and not knowing how to go about this in a credible way. So we found we've studied lots of brands. We've got a communications framework that we coach to people and brands that we follow ourselves, and it works with everybody, and it predated the Green Claims Code actually. So we developed this in 2019. Green Claims Code came out in 2021. A couple of things about the Green Claims Code from a really practical point of view I think are really important to share. It's completely industry agnostic, so B2B, B2C, every industry. If you make a claim that has a social or environmental message, sustainability message in it, it can be caught. Also, the ASA are using AI to look for claims. It's complaints based, and a lot of people think that it's actually the public that make complaints about it, but it's not. It can often be your competitors, or it can be other activist groups, and it covers all potential touch points, including influencers. And I think the mistake that a lot of people have made is they've just pushed out big above the line campaigns with one catchy strapline that is not substantiated. And the Green Claims Code is built on 6 super practical guidelines. Now, they have a lot of information that backs them up, but the 6 super practical guidelines are just things like be honest, tell the truth, be factual. And they've issued a lot of guidance on things like net zero claims, how to dispose of products, recycling claims. So get familiar with those claims. But I would say you touched on something really important there. The starting point isn't actually a big brief for external communications. It is, someone else mentioned on the call, it's getting across everything you've achieved so far, your credentials first, getting them down and having them somewhere for the consumers or customers to whom that's really important publicly, and updating that. And then it's also getting your team involved, because the language of people working at the sharp end of operations and production is very different to the language of people at marketing and brand and having to communicate that. So even getting them to speak the same language, internal communications is really important. Board presentations and getting internal buy-in and getting factual key messages internally for your team, and that will help to build the blocks for substantiated communications. And I would just say the key thing is I've written a blog about it. It should be available after this, which will say it in a much more articulate way than I'm sure I'm communicating here and right now. We've given 7 points on what we've learned about sustainability communications. But my key watch points would be, don't make big daft statements like kinder to the planet, because it's not. In your little corner of the world, you're actually not saving the planet, right? So we have to be real about the statements we're making. So that's what the Green Claims Code is there to do. Substantiate things, make sure it's true, make sure you can back it up. Don't spend your hard fought for marketing budget on campaigning your own credentials. We've done this in our business. So what? That's just table stakes now. You're supposed to be doing that stuff. Save your hard fought budget for when you've actually got something new or different or innovative that you've put a lot of effort into. So yeah, I think the blog will say it much better than I have. But there are different rules of engagement. But once you know them, it is really possible to find your way around them. And we are all creative people. And the great thing about the future in the next 20 years is it's all going to need and require creative collaboration and transformation, which is what, as an industry, we are brilliant at. So I think it's actually a very, very exciting time to have this as something that's on our watch. So embrace it.
Thanks. We've probably got another sort of 2-3 minutes of panel topic, and then we'll move on to any Q&A. So just any sort of closing thoughts, anything else that anyone wants to put forward?
The one thing I think we haven't really touched on, we've talked a lot about environment. I think, Kirsty touched on it there. The social side of ESG, I think, is something that people need to think about. And I know I sort of said with the, thinking about putting the customer first, thinking about people first. But some of the most straightforward stuff around social action, I think, is critical for business as well. It's even if you're a small business, it's also some of the most fun stuff. I mean, with the greatest respect to the environmental stuff, it can get a bit serious and worthy a bit. But we've done some really fun things where we sent some young people to do schools fairs. They're trying to be more inclusive in marketing, and those were not just useful for the schools that we did them with; they were great fun. So a bit of social outreach. We've sponsored a kids football team. So a bit of social inclusion can not only be good for your business, good for the soul, good for society, but it can be a lot of fun as well.
Great. Anything else from yourself, Ray or Chris? I've got one question here at the moment that we definitely want to touch on before we finish.
Well, let's go to the questions, shall we?
Cool. So Andrew, you mentioned here that B Corp is a big resource for startups and smaller organizations. And Pete, you sort of felt that you were in that middle zone, that if you were bigger or smaller, it would be much easier. But I guess if there's a one-page roadmap, if there's a simple way to focus on getting started, what do you do? How do you go about that?
I mean, I can speak to the B Corp thing in a pretty straightforward way. It's really user friendly. I mean, we sort of got gulled. We've got sort of got gulled into doing it because the way it works is it starts off with a self-completion questionnaire, and the task is to get to 80 points, and that proves to you that you're in the zone of being accredited. And the first 60 points are really easy to get. And we were like building the first 60 going, this is a breeze, this is going to be dead straightforward. The last 20 were a nightmare. So it's quite an entertaining thing to do. And I would, it doesn't. So the self-completion thing of it is I'm not saying it's fun, but it gives you a framework for thinking about your own business in a very straightforward, user-friendly way that's highly consumable. It won't take you very long to do the first part of it, but it opens your mind immediately to some of the things you are or aren't doing. One of the simple questions was like, do you have a non-exec director? And we were like, no, we don't. So, there's some very straightforward things in it that you can sort of open your mind to just the way you do things. And I think it's when we went, it took us 2 years to do it, and the final part of it was pretty. I hesitate to use the word painful, but it was. They're relentless. Once you go through the certification process, they keep coming back and asking for evidence, which in our case was all very well. We were doing the things, but didn't have a great track record of gathering the evidence in the first place. So, but the backtracking was the tricky part for us at the time. But I think it's a really worthwhile process. Even if you don't go for certification, the sheer process of opening your mind through the, you might not even agree with some of it, but at least you've considered it. So I think it's a really valuable process.
Our hot take took us 2 years as well, and we had to treat it like a client with an internal team that we've set to it and with deadlines. And that was the way we got through it. We treated it like it was client work so that it didn't get pushed down the agenda. And we got there.
Brilliant.
Not
Have
already
you seen the
selling it, you know
benefit
that.
of it? Are you glad that you've ticked that box?
Sorry, Lindsay, I spoke over you.
No, you're fine, don't worry. So we have one more question here from Charissa. So would be interested to know if ESG is still the most appropriate terminology for these discussions, or are the panel seeing brands and businesses moving away from that? And if so, what are they moving towards?
And people are the different language you'll see. ESG is very corporate. It's used in a lot of financial metrics and measures. It's quite old school. It stands for obviously environment, social, and governance. It does cover off everything that needs to be covered. We tend to talk about SES, or social and environmental sustainability, and people that maybe work more at the sharp end of resilience and adaptation talk about things like climate impact, resilience, and adaptation. But I would say we prefer social and environmental sustainability because it just feels more accessible. But that's because of the companies that we're and the brands that we're working with. ESG certainly is right for sort of bigger corporates, but it's just getting a bit of a bad rap at the minute because it's associated with certain financial structures, systems, etc. And it's just quite old school. I think this sort of terminology always gets challenged. I wouldn't sweat it too much, but I don't know if someone's got a different opinion on that.
No, I think I can concur with you on that one, Kirsty. It's definitely for us, it is like that. Environment and social sustainability, and we kind of almost frame it to a single word as sustainability, and use that as more all-encompassing when we speak. Yeah,
it's interesting when you say it's trying to soften the term because it's a bit sounds just like reporting. We're seeing and we're hearing from the big accounting firms that the whole ESG within corporates, actually now the policy's set, now everything's starting to get in place and it's through the company, the function's going to move to finance. So it's actually, we'll see in the next few years, it will become just another, like we do our financial reporting, the numbers will just be, and that group will shrink within organizations. I don't know if that's true. Do you have a view on that, Kirsty?
That goes for the reporting, but there's a whole other side of ESG, the risk management, which is opportunity creation, innovation, creativity, and collaboration, which is the external facing side. That's the internal and the reporting due diligence side of it. That language, yes, it is going to have to be very unified, and it's going to have to, everyone's going to have to account and report to the same standards, and we're lacking that at the minute. But I do think there is. And you come at it from a side of net zero data reporting. I come at it from the side of communications and trying to engage more stakeholders in it, because engaging people in the journey is a way to sort of rally the troops towards the goal. So I find that social and environmental sustainability opens the doors to different types of stakeholders. But I just think it goes to show that there's the risk mitigation and reporting and due diligence side of this, and then there's also the engagement, the creation, the communication, the collaboration side of it, and it's going to take both. So
Kirsty, can I just throw one question at you, and this will need to be the last one, I think, but related to what you've just said there. So Dave's asking, are we seeing the emergence of purpose hushing, where companies choose to dial down the focus on social and environmental issues within their campaigns and comms? And if so, is that necessarily a problem?
No, I think it's actually quite good that I think people should be talking about this at the right time. So it's finding the right place and time to take your message over the top and pick the right channels as well for this, because substantiation is really important. It's not about making the daft, catchy claim that breaches every one of the 6 Green Claims Code mandates that we saw at the start. There was really big brands getting their knuckles rapped, and I think that scared people. But when you're familiar with the Green Claims Code and the rules and the tenets that sort of back it up, you just have to be, it just requires more creativity and a lot of due diligence internally to make sure that what you're saying stands up to scrutiny and that you've got the substantiation to back it up. So I think it's about picking the right time to share the right message. And for example, I've said before, I don't think that is campaigning your credentials. When we're 100% renewable energy now as a business, well, you should just be aiming to do that as a business. If you have worked hard to introduce a new circular service for your customers, something that's a real benefit to your customers, then that's what's going to actually make a difference. And that's where you should put your hard-earned cash and get your messaging right. So, and I think there are brands who are scared to talk, but they shouldn't be, because all the rules to engage are there, and it does actually create a level playing field for everybody, which is a really good thing. So it stops it being the Wild West, which it has been for the last 3 to 4 years.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists today. That's been really great. I'm sure you'll be more than happy if anyone wants to reach out to you directly with any questions. We've got a couple of questions here that we haven't managed to cover off. So myself and the team will have a look and be in touch, and we'll get back to those people. But just before we head off, T, I think you maybe had just a quick event summary of forthcoming events that you wanted to share with everyone.
Laura's going to pop those in the chat for me now.
Fab, thank you. Well, thanks so much for your time today, everyone. Lovely to see you all, and we'll catch up with you all soon.